Okay, so we are here with now a friend, Nicholas Pearson, author, teacher, researcher extraordinaire. I've been saying this to everyone, but I mean it so sincerely. Thank you for agreeing to take this time to spend this time with us on the podcast.
My I I'm just so grateful. My job is words for a living, and I'm kind of speechless. Like this is just so magical because I love that you led with the friend piece because that's honestly how I
Yeah,
feel. Like you're just part of my soul family,
yeah,
and I can't wait for there to be less physical distance
I
between
know.
us. But we'll do the virtual for now.
Yes, I already have plans in my mind. I hope to meet you at one of your events that you ever do in Massachusetts one day. Because, I grew up there. So I'm like, that's where I'll meet Nicholas.
Absolutely.
But in this first hour, I just want to say, just to give people a little bit of background, I'm not going to ask you so much about how this all started because I don't know if you know, but this is the fifth time that you've been on Reiki Radio. Plus,
Oh,
I've had the pleasure of interviewing you in the Reiki Raise Summit. So we've had lots of conversations. So if you want to know about how like all this started for Nicholas, go back. There's a lot of episodes about that. But you are so well known, not just for the work and the research and the clarity you bring to the Reiki community. You are very well known for your work with crystals and minerals and these sorts of things. So I wanted to start there because you do have this new book, Crystals for Psychic Self Defense. One of the things I wanted to ask you, first of all, is you have different books specific to different ways to work with crystals. Why did you do it that way? Is it just because it's so broad or what?
yeah. I think there are a lot of different facets to this. One is, kind of I guess we'll say selfishly, I want to stay engaged with my own practice. The moment I stop learning is the moment I'm going to be stagnant, is the moment I'm going to be an ineffective teacher and probably an ineffective human being.
Right.
So if I can find one little piece of the puzzle and allow myself to fall down the rabbit hole, I'm going to learn things I didn't know. I'm going
Right.
to learn things that I didn't know had never come across my path. The other part that I like kind of doing these really specialized entryways into the world of crystals is because there are a million and one like basic crystal books. I say that with a lot of love in my heart because I wrote two books with the word basics in the
Yeah.
title. And neither were my first book. Most people start there. I waited till like book six to get there. So when it comes to something like just protection, just karmic healing, just the divine feminine. Oftentimes, these specific topics showed up in my writing because they showed up in my life
Mm,
repeatedly, repeatedly. Like uh, this book, and I'm sure we'll get into it, it took a really long time to finish, and that is not like me. It's really not like me. I wrote my second book in 27 days. I'm not going to promise that.
wow.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend it was a really great draft, but it was a whole draft, and it felt effortless. This book was not like that. It was
Yeah.
so different to that experience, and I can attribute a large part of that to not having mastered the lessons I thought I did. So part of picking just one little corner of the crystal world is because that's an area I need for myself. And I'm not very special. I mean, I'm as human as the next person. If I'm facing these things, other people must be too. And
Right.
and that's the benefit of specializing.
Yeah. It's funny you say, I was telling you right before we recorded, I also sat with one of our mutual teachers, our Java sensei. And in the episode, he talks about this as well, like why he writes. He writes to know, he writes to understand. And it's funny that you're starting this way because when I was reading this book, that's what I was wondering. I was like, have you encountered a lot of this? This is why these topics came to the surface for you. What was it? Because you're so in depth. And I wanted to talk to you about some of the topics, not all of them, because people can get the book for it. But there were certain things that I guess it's an interesting relationship with you in terms of it's like you have a foot in the Reiki world, a foot in the crystal world, and easily those go hand in hand. But because of some of the topics you talk about in the crystal realm, a lot of people may not be as familiar with if they're only in the Reiki side of the street. So that's where my curiosity came from. And also for you, is it kind of like two different worlds, two different audiences? How is that for you?
I am really thankful. I'm very lucky that every time I pick something new and different to write about, I get a good amount of crossover in
Yeah.
my audience. Surely there are people who got introduced to me only from my crystal work and got curious about Reiki or vice versa. But a lot of those people went on their journey with me into flower essences and
Yes.
may go on a journey with me into some other projects in the future. So there are going to be works that appeal to this group or that group, but I do find a good amount of overlap. The challenge that I have is often within one umbrella
Mm.
of people, there are still lots of little groups. We're not a monolith in any group because
Right.
we're all individuals. And one of the challenges that I really struggled with in this particular book was serving different people's needs with crystals. Different audiences have different expectations. And lovingly, we've got our Healy Feely crowd, the energy healers, the woo, all of that juicy goodness. And
Right.
then we've got our serious occultists. I wear both of those hats. I mean, I take my writing too seriously, but I don't take my life too seriously.
Yeah.
Uh, and I just wanted to hope that I could meet the needs of people who came to crystals for different reasons and had different takeaways because this notion of protection throughout time, throughout culture, throughout all of those perceived differences, it is a unifying thread of the human experience.
Right.
Every single group of people throughout all of history, written and before the prehistoric period, we've been concerned with our safety and the safety of our loved ones and the longevity of our, not just our lives, but the stories that we carry within us going forward. So this notion of protection is something that we all relate to.
Yeah.
And uh, my personal challenge was getting some of that like more, I don't want to say serious, like making it more important, but we'll say more focused, kind of historically rooted occult practice to sit comfortably beside our more recent kind of emerging trends in the crystal world and show that there's space at the table for everyone. And that's kind of how I feel about Reiki. And maybe we'll talk about this later, but like we're all in this together. There's room for all of you at my table.
Yeah. I love that. Well, yes, with the Reiki, we'll definitely talk about that because we'll get there. But the thing about this book, and I was so drawn into it, I guess it's because in the background, I have a lot of different interests and I've studied many different things. And there are a lot of different elements to my practice. Some I don't talk about because I tend to talk about Reiki a lot, intuition a lot. But there are so many perspectives, ideas, judgments, points of view, everything about everything within the realm of spirituality. And what I appreciate about your work is you always come from this lens of a blend of the scientific and the traditional and the historical and how it all relates to what's going on in modern times. But this is a huge topic, even in the realm of energy work, is this protection. People are really concerned with, especially what they feel. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that before we go into some of the specifics, because when you were saying about, in ancient times, like us always having this idea, I was thinking about how we hear stories of even what was going on with the weather, what was going on with Earth. People may have assumed they were being cursed or something bad, a bad omen. But what do you think about that part? Just what we're designed to be able to sense and feel. Because I would imagine that people can feel and sense things, and it's not necessarily bad, but it creates fear just because they don't know what it is.
Yeah, what a great topic. We always have to like check our own biases here. So when we talk about these kinds of experiences, obviously it's through a modern filter, a modern westernized filter.
Right.
And we collectively tend to be taught to ignore these kinds of sensations, to be a little bit more focused on the mundane, the material, the things we can measure.
Right.
But this hasn't always been the case. And if we look at like the sum total of humanity that has ever lived so far, this very materialist approach to experiencing the world is an extremely small percentage of worldviews that have ever existed, have ever been implemented, have ever, I mean, it is really unusual that it has become the dominant narrative when we consider most of human history has been kind of antithetical to this. So we have to do a little bit of unpacking of baggage to arrive at a more holistic understanding of perception.
Mm.
And I think it is because the, we'll say, the more than human worlds are so contrarian to this material view, we treat them with skepticism. We treat them with suspicion. And both of those things breed fear. Like if you're really skeptical that something exists and then you experience it anyway,
Right.
logic and culture at large says, no, no, this can't happen. Well, it's happening. So something has to be wrong. So is something wrong with me? Is something wrong in this place? Is my worldview entirely wrong? And we're wired for that flight or fight or fawn or free or whatever we say now. There are too many F's in that for me to remember them all, but it's that whole experience of like cognitive dissonance.
Right.
So I think it is important that we take a step back and always start asking why. It's just a really healthy practice. I do this pretty much for everything, uh, wherever possible. And what I'm finding is in really unusual places, people have very human tendencies to regard the world as inherently alive. Even people who would not consider themselves animists,
Right.
even people who would not consider themselves particularly spiritual. I can't tell you the number of my friends in like the STEM world, especially like hard sciences, who have their own little laboratory cultures. Things like, oh, well, the scanning electron microscope, don't touch the rubber duck on top of it. It doesn't work unless the rubber duck is there. It needs the rubber duck. Or, we name the X-ray diffraction thing and we make sure that she's always got her favorite music playing. Or, you have to knock on the table twice before you boot up this computer to run this. And like even in the places where hard science exists and we're trying to be as measurable and material and science oriented as we can, there is a kind of whimsy to the world that we need.
Yeah.
And I think a good amount of skepticism keeps us from falling down the rabbit hole of being terrified at everything and worried that something is always out to get you.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to realize that the world is a lot more fun when it is mysterious. The world is a lot more fun when there are things we can't see with our physical eyes, most of the time at least. And if we start there, we can allow curiosity to lead us. And that curiosity can supersede fear in most circumstances, as long as we can unpack some baggage.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting hearing you say this because it makes me think of how, what we can perceive with our physical sensory. I mean, we can still be in denial. I mean, people deny everything, what's right in front of their face plainly, right? Um, but it's interesting when you say this because it makes me think of how people will be very hard lined about what they believe in and what they don't, but then they will use language for essentially the same thing, right? Like, I don't believe in ghosts or different energies or entities, but I absolutely believe in angels or something else that's unseen, so to speak, right? So it is funny how a lot of people will be so rigid about this non-belief in the unseen, and yet they will still say things that give you the notion that you actually do. You're just picking and choosing which aspects of it to say you believe in. And I think it's interesting because I think, why wouldn't you be curious about what really does exist? I don't know. But that, going back to the feeling of it all, one of the topics that came up in your book, I think is very interesting, is the source of psychic harm. So a lot of people do have this fear, like you say, they have the evil eye, they wear a red string, all these different ways we have of protection. But what is that fear in the first place? So could you talk a little bit about this psychic harm, and in the lens of, even you write about like what may be a curse or projection versus our own self harm?
Yeah, this is really kind of the crux of it all. Um, really transparently. One of the motivating factors in writing this book, I started writing this immediately after finishing the manuscript for Crystal Basics. So this would have been sometime in 2019. I turned over the edits to the big one that came out in 2020. And I thought, the number one question I get asked in my day job in metaphysical retail is, I need something to protect me. What can I have to protect me? What crystal is good for protecting me from Cheryl at the office? What can I use because I think so and so is cursing me? And all of these things related to the idea of safety and security. And what I wanted to do was address a lot of needs, like I mentioned, but also be really mindful that it's easy to get the sensationalized version of stuff. And yes, there are people out there enacting ritual curses in cultures all around the world, in neighborhoods all throughout the US.
Right.
Uh, but it's also the least likely cause of psychic harm. Far more likely, we're going to ourselves be more sensitive to certain kinds of energies and experiences. Some of us, by training or by identity or whatever it might be, are hypervigilant to other folks' emotions, and that can be quite a burden to bear.
Yeah.
We can be sensitive in other ways. We can be, naturally predisposed to our psychic and intuitive senses, but not have really good training for how to filter stuff out that isn't useful. We can walk into a room where an argument has taken place and all that displaced emotional stuff is just hanging in the air. And if we don't have good boundaries, it clings to us. We draw it in. There are some folks whose compassion is so great, they come across unintentionally, unconsciously, they come across something in the world needing of healing, and they go, "Oh, well, I'm going to make this my problem now,
Mhm.
so it can get healed." And that's a noble thing, but also we shouldn't have to put ourselves out to help someone else, right? We don't have to set ourselves on fire to keep someone else warm.
Right.
And also coming back to this idea of self, the only completely inescapable source of psychic harm in our lives is ourselves. How many times in a day do you have a thought that critiques yourself? Oh, Nicholas, you missed this deadline. How could you be so stupid? Or you didn't manage your time well enough. You're not going to get warmed up for rehearsal. Or, well, you sat on the couch for 2 hours and now you have no energy. So I guess your whole day is a wreck. You're just useless.
Yeah.
These are like real thoughts I have on a weekly basis, sometimes
Right.
more often. And that stuff adds up. Our fears, our projections, our worries, all the baggage. And so we can't exactly shield against that. We can't, create a bubble that keeps that out because it's already inside us. So we have to learn other tools in those cases. So when I get met by so many of these questions about protection, I want to ensure that people are seen and heard, and also that we, as much as people have the bandwidth to, we hone in on the source of things. Because the last thing someone needs who believes they've been cursed, even though when we go through the checklist, they have none of the signs or symptoms, they don't know anyone capable of doing it, they've never even met a person who practices some kind of ritual magic, but they're still worried about it.
Yeah.
You don't want to dismiss that, because that worry is a source of psychic harm.
Yeah. I think it's so important. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because I don't think a lot of people would even consider the potential of what they need protection from is their own thought forms, and it's a very real thing. But it also comes to mind in the realm that we work in. A lot of people tend to think as well, not just, oh, something's going on in my life, so I must be under attack, or, I feel a certain way about somebody, so they must be projecting something back at me, but it's literally your projection. But a lot of people in this realm are so afraid of, what am I going to pick up in session? What if I have a client come in and they're full of bad energy, so to speak, right? And it always is an interesting thing to me that there's more of a, I guess, fear of what I may pick up in session versus walking through the grocery store. It's like we're always in this energetic exchange, but then it goes back to the story. Do you have any thoughts around that? Like, have you heard that a lot?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's funny. I wrote this whole manual of protection with crystals, but I don't teach any form of protection in Reiki, right?
Yeah.
It's such a different experience. And and to kind of compare these, contrast these practices, in a perfect world, if I can achieve that state of being in oneness, being in
Yes.
pure compassion, being without worry and anger and fear and all this stuff, in a Reiki session, I'm not going to pick anything up.
Right.
If I could achieve the same state of being around the clock without fail, I really wouldn't have anything to shield myself from, barring a few things, right?
Yeah.
There are systemic patterns that we're all subject to. There are generational things we're all working on. And every now and then, it's rare, but you do run across someone who has it out for you, and they're sending icky vibes your way, to use some
Yes.
really untechnical terms. And in those situations, sure, I'd like to bolster my defenses. But the truth is that I'm a human being. My clients and students and friends and loved ones are human beings. And sometimes we just need a little extra support. So when we're at the grocery store, that's actually like, that's my kryptonite. When we go to the really big international grocery store, because we love what we can get there,
Yeah.
it is so busy. People drive from so far away to get there, and if we go on a weekend, I'm just like a little chihuahua shivering in the rain on a bad day, because I have to take so much time away from my to-do list, and I'm concerned about that, and I always feel like I'm in the way, and it's always like, oh, I'm such an inconvenience to everyone around me,
Yeah.
and I shrink myself so much. But then when I put these kinds of things into practice, when I project that light, when I get really grounded, when I'm really clear, it's like the mental noise disappears. No one in that grocery store is out to get me,
Right.
but I sure am. I'm out to get me.
Right.
um, and that's such a different kind of situation to consider. And sure, maybe I accidentally bump into someone with my cart and they send some terrible vibes my way. It hasn't happened yet, but I mean, statistically speaking, some of us are going to encounter such a thing. If we have good psychic hygiene, if we're grounded and centered, if we do like our regular spiritual practice, those kinds of energies, they're really not going to do much at all to us.
Yeah.
Uh, and if we don't have as regular a practice on those kind of fundamentals, then it's probably a really good idea to just have a few other protocols in place, some kind of shielding, some kind of protection, some kind of stabilizing practice in your life.
Right. You bring to mind, there was this one circumstance, I'll say, a friend of mine and I, she was coming to my house one day. And when she got there, she was like, I don't know why. Something was telling me to put this crystal in my pocket before coming over here today. And I don't remember what kind of crystal it was, but we both were just like, that's weird. Why would you, you know? And the crystal was somehow associated with like protection kind of energy. And she had been to my place a million times. I mean, and we were good friends. It's not like she felt like she needed protection against me. Anyway, she was there, and unexpectedly, someone called and asked if they could come over. And the person came over, and as soon as they came, I felt very protective, like in my posture, everything shifted. And I was looking at the person, and on things happened. But literally, something came out of this person where my friend and I, we both saw it, the person felt it, all of the things. but we couldn't get over the fact that something in her knew to put that crystal in her pocket before she came over. And so I wanted to ask you about this too, because you mentioned, you know, the things will happen sometimes unintentionally. And a lot of people do have their barriers down. And this person who came, she happened to work at a bar. She was very sensitive to energy. She didn't really manage her energy, we'll say it that way. How common is that, that a lot of people who are empathic, sensitive, that they allow stuff in and don't even realize it?
Yeah, it's super common. This was me for a majority of my existence on this earth.
Yeah,
Um, I, as a teen, got labeled with that magical little label of empath
yeah,
that, I wanted to wear as a badge, but it wore me, not the other way around. I can remember the very first time I ever went to like a large for where I lived kind of gem show, not our little local thing, but a big wholesale experience. And I was there as a guest of my local metaphysical store. They brought me along so I could help them pick rocks because I had a
yeah,
good eye for rocks. And I was just overwhelmed by the energy of the crystals, by the number of people, by being in a different place, by the energy of the place itself. And like I was just so fried by the end of it. I was a zombie for like the 2.5 hour ride home.
wow,
Um, and it was so fun to play with rocks, but I remember instead of being in this really joyful state, I was in just such an uncomfortable position. I'd get those moments of joy. Oh my gosh, look at this crystal. And then it would be, oh, I feel everything from everyone. And it's really just bad boundaries. I have a very dear friend, Dan Lupicino. Some years ago, we were chatting about this idea of being an empath, of sensitivity. And he said to me, Nicholas, I'm going to give you the piece of advice that I give all of my like long-term clients and students. Just mind your own damn business.
mhm,
Other people's emotions are none of your business.
yeah,
Unless you enter into a conscious and intentional reason to
right,
have a conversation around it, it's not your business. You're walking through the mall. Someone else's bad day is someone else's bad day. That doesn't mean you can't be compassionate, that you can't radiate kindness to all people, but you don't have to
right,
take their problems home with you.
right,
And so a lot of us, we learn about some kind of sensitivity, whether it's being psychic, being an empath, a highly sensitive person, neurodivergent. There's so many ways we can be wired towards sensitivity. And we can identify with that label so strongly that we forget we have any agency at all in the situation.
right, yeah,
The, the human condition includes empathy. When we forget that we all have some empathic traits and we want to think ourselves as extra special for being an empath, we like hone in on that to the neglect of the rest of the human condition, the rest of the human experience. This is something I did for so long. I can tell you the burnout is so real.
yeah.
So again, some of the lessons I needed to learn, I thought I'd mastered, they circled back around in the course of writing this book. And I had to also learn how to mind my own business, energetically speaking.
I love that. Again, something I wish I would have heard that like years ago, 10 years ago, but that is great for a lot of us to hear, especially people that have those energetic sensitivities and then will want to retreat or retract. There's so much. That's part of the reason I love Reiki because it helped me come into relationship with my own energy so that I didn't then feel victimized by everything I felt. Another story, another day. But you talk about so many incredible things in this book. Again, I think a lot of people are curious about, may not have language around. And, you know, I have to ask you about this as well, the banishing unwanted energies. And because that seems to be, even if we aren't sure of what we're sensing, feeling, or even sometimes just making up in our own minds, there is also this thing of like, I need to get rid of, not just protect, I need to banish and protect. And when I was reading it, I also studied ritual magic and did the LBRP for quite a while. And it was interesting. I love that you came up with your own technique with the banishing ritual of the precious stones. I was like, ooh, I can't wait to try this one. But I wanted to talk to you about that as well. When people want to protect, do you recommend that you clear first? Or is it kind of like if you don't clear first, are you just entrapping yourself with the energy that you want to get away from?
Yeah, right on the nose. So let's imagine you want to go do some gardening and you don't have a trowel or something. So you start digging with your hands and your hands get really dirty.
Yeah.
And then you're going to go, I don't know, plant a rose bush and it's got thorns. And you go, oh, so I need to go get protected from all of the dangers out there.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to put the gloves on. Well, your hands are filthy under those gloves. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but
Yeah.
like we've missed an opportunity to have a clean slate. They're going to get sweaty and grimy and gross under those gloves. And sure, the thorns aren't going to get us, but something else might.
Right.
So, what if we wash our hands or start with clean hands and then put the gloves on? And then the gloves get dirty. And then it's a really simple fix.
Yeah.
Toss them in the washing machine or we hose them off and that's it. But we don't have to go through all of those layers of cleansing, clearing, protecting ourselves. If we've taken care of the preventive stuff, it's a cliche, but you know, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like if we just do the spiritual hygiene up front, it saves us so much trouble. And to be honest, the vast majority of the things we as a human race might be worried about as far as self-defense goes, psychically,
Hmm.
energetically, spiritually, can be taken care of with cleansing, grounding, centering, period.
Yeah.
We probably don't need a strong shield in most circumstances. We probably don't need banishing magic. We probably don't need all this other stuff. But if it's there, also having those practices is useful. If we get unwanted guests who are already inside the house, that's not the time to go lock the door. They're
Yeah.
already in. We got to get them. You got to go, okay, Aunt Margaret, I love you. We got somewhere to be. You can't camp out here any longer, right?
Yeah.
So banishing doesn't have to be something we do out of hate or spite or fear. It's just about owning our space, wearing our kind of sovereign agency,
Mm.
and being able to enact our will.
I like this view that was coming to mind too, reading your book around all of this is sometimes because a lot of people are hardlined with like, you don't need anything. And some people are like, absolutely, these things work. And for me, what I've experienced is I think a lot of times working with protective energies, rituals, all of these different things, they allow us to relax in a lot of ways while we're learning even how to strengthen our own energy or build up our own defenses and all of these things. So I don't think for me it's nothing to poo-poo on, It is very helpful for people. And sometimes it helps people relax their mind where they don't have to be hyper focused on what potentially they're afraid of because now they feel, there are other energies that they're working with and working in support of. But I love that you did come up with your own because I always tell people don't be limited by our own teachers. Don't be limited by anything you read. Like if you feel an inspiration or you feel guided, you have to trust that. I mean, something's coming through for you, right? So, how was this for you? Coming up with this ritual for yourself. Did you try or it just kind of dropped in?
So, for listeners who might not be familiar, the LBRP, or the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, is something that we see in certain forms of ceremonial magic and magical lodges, like the Golden Dawn traditions. And like in high school, I read about these things and, I made a couple of attempts, but nothing really stuck. And then I was taking some like longer format training through the Temple of Witchcraft with Christopher Penczak using his like distance learning online school program. And one of our it wasn't really extracurricular. Like we had to read the book. We just didn't necessarily have to do everything in the book, but we read one of his books, The Witch's Shield, for this the lesson on protection.
Right.
And there are certain things we had to accomplish, but the book went into really good detail on the LBRP. Has a CD with just the script of it that you can follow along with, as well as a narrated version that describes the ritual actions.
Mm.
So a short track and a very long track, and that combination of reading, listening, and doing made it stick. So I think I probably did the lesser banishing ritual at least 5 days a week, and at least twice each of those days,
Wow.
for somewhere in the ballpark of like 6 to 9 months. Just because I liked it.
Yeah.
I loved how it made me feel. I felt literally on top of the world. And for anyone who's done it, that's visualization we do.
Yes.
And it solved a lot of other problems. Not without any effort on mine, but it certainly took care of a lot. And I thought to myself, okay, I love these archetypal forces that we're invoking, these angelic forces.
Hmm.
But I'm a crystal guy, and gems and angels have a really long tradition. You know this is a thing I've explored. So what if I chose gemstones to represent the same archetypes, and we called on the intelligences of these crystals? We might think of them as devas, we might think of them as oversouls, we might just think of them as the kind of symbolism or metaphor of the stone itself. And I chose them to be very carefully aligned with the directions and the archangels. And there's disagreement on who gets what, and that's fine. And then there was like one extra component. In the original LBRP script, we use the line something like uh, about me flames a pentagram, within me shines a six-rayed star. I think I've got that slightly off, but it was this within me part. So I'm like, I've got four gems around me, but what's going to go in the middle? And just immediately, diamond, who is poetically the king of gems, the
Yeah.
incomparable. The word diamond actually means damas, unconquerable, cannot be tamed.
Wow.
So it's that indomitable, another word related to diamond, force that we kind of put into the center. And so the ritual actions are not exactly like we see in the LBRP. There's
Yes.
some like extra credit involved, and I got some ceremonialists to try it and give me feedback, and I was like, you should just throw this whole middle part out. And I'm like, thank you for your feedback. And it's someone that I love and I really respect his opinion, but I did not throw it out. It just Diamond showed me how to do this, so we're doing it the way Diamond showed me.
Yeah. No, I love this. And it's interesting because all of this, again, regardless of what our different thoughts, opinions may be, everything you're saying highlights that whole thing of direction of mind and power of mind. Because even when we go into relationship, not just with the ritual, but even with crystals, and you talk about relationship building with the crystals in the book, it's always incredible to me how everything points back to mind. But really, again, like the power of what we concentrate on, the power of what we believe, our intent, our how we amplify it all by, movement, sound, all these things, right? And that I also have to ask you, for everyone listening, the experience you've had with intensifying that relationship to your crystals, and not just, I don't know, just setting them out. What difference do you notice in actually creating that connection?
I think I have a really simple analogy for this.
Mm.
Um, if we need to get our taxes done, we Google accountants and we pick someone. That person is our accountant. We've chosen, person A to align with intention B, and that's it. That's all they are to us.
Yeah.
So I need grounding. I look at the list. I go, hematite is for grounding. Great. It's going to do that.
Right.
But that person who's doing our taxes is a whole person. They have other interests. They have a whole life. We hope they're more than just an accountant. In all likelihood, they're more than just a numbers person. So it's the same with our crystals. Um, I I have a very special fondness for rhodonite. I know we've got the audio, a video, so anyone who might be watching this, this is rhodonite. It's this
So
kind of
pretty.
pinkish mineral. We've got some black manganese oxides, and I chose rhodonite against my own advice, very prescriptively, to help me with the symptoms of my anxiety disorder. And it became this really kind of trusted ally, really stabilizing, grounding influence in my life. And I wore or carried or did other practices with rhodonite for several years before it finally dawned on me how much love I had for this stone. It wasn't just I appreciated the end results, it was that I started to notice it showing up in other ways in my life. And, we can pick the accountant from our Google search.
Hmm.
We can also have a really close friend who's an accountant who might give us tax advice. They might also be there to help us pick up the pieces after a bad breakup or pack the boxes of our life away to move to a new city. Like they're not just one thing.
Yeah.
So the difference between working prescriptively with crystals and building a relationship with them is that, of course, rhodonite shows up to help me with the emotional grounding, a bit of emotional protection and support. But it is also a stone that deeply inspires me, that helps me draw forth new skills and talents, that allows me, challenges me to be more open and compassionate while at the same time not taking on the noise of the world.
Yeah.
And I think those things all track with like a description of what we would expect from rhodonite, but at the same time, if you turn to your average crystal person, collector, teacher, healer, writer, whoever, and said, "Hey, so is rhodonite really good for learning new languages?" People would probably say, "No, there's so many better stones for learning." But rhodonite settles the noise of my mind so well that it's a great ally for me when I want to learn a new skill. And I have learned two new languages. I mean, I've forgotten one of them and almost all of the other, but it is an ally that actually supported me in this way, even though that's not in its CV, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah. It's so wild you saying this. And when I remember when I first came into this realm, you hear a lot about crystals, but I had no idea. I was like, I don't know. And people are, oh, just get the crystals. And I was like, why? I don't understand. And so I would go, I found a crystal shop with a very, very cool owner of the shop. If you ever come to San Diego, I have to take you to her. You would love her. But anyway, I started just choosing them based on what I liked. And for whatever reason, I would always pick stones that look like this, had some kind of I don't know, just not polished. I really like the ones that weren't so polished. So anyway, one day I was cleaning my house, and for whatever reason, something told me to stop and just meditate with the crystal. And it was the first time I had this exchange with a crystal where it felt like this entire conversation was emerging. It was mind blowing. And then today, before talking to you, there is one crystal that I keep on my desk. I didn't remember why. And as soon as I grabbed it, I was going to do the exercise you have in the book with programming the crystal. And as soon as I closed my eyes and tuned in, what I originally programmed years ago instantly came back to mind. And it made me laugh like, oh my God, like the crystal just reminded me of like, hey, I already have a job. And I forgot what it was. So do you talk or communicate with your crystals a lot in that way too, as like teachers, or what is your communication about with them?
You know, when I was a teenager, really like diving into crystals head first when I kind of found some open doors. It wasn't just I liked rocks and collected rocks, which I did, and
Yeah.
read a little bit about them, but it actually became a spiritual practice for me. I can remember the very first time I ever heard a crystal speak. Obviously not with my physical ears, but
Yeah.
like with a voice. And truth be told, very few crystals just talk to me like that. This one
Yeah.
is truly an exception. And it just blew my mind. And at the same time, I had that thought I think we all have is, am I going crazy? I don't think I can tell other people about this. I know I've read about this in books, but it can't be real. And so sometimes there is that kind of verbal, auditory, very kind of language oriented communication. There are exercises that I will do that very intentionally kind of invoke the, let's say, the indwelling spirit or intelligence of a stone. And whether they're speaking in words or vibrations doesn't matter. My brain is going to translate it into something I can comprehend. So it comes out in words. But oftentimes that communication looks more like an inner knowing, an inner feeling. Sometimes it is very visual, and that can be really abstract. It can also
Right.
be very clearly symbolic. And we all have differently wired brains. We're going to have different skill sets. So if you're trying to communicate with a crystal and you don't get words, what are you getting? Do you notice any impressions in your body? Is your emotional state changing? Do you just have an indwelling sense of peace that came out of nowhere? Are there images? Like, what thoughts are coming into your mind or disappearing from your mind? These are all ways that we can get into relationship with crystals. They can communicate in very subtle ways. We have to remember that the life cycle of your average rock is very slow. So we have to learn to slow down to experience that. And if
Mhm.
we can cultivate stillness, emptiness, spaciousness, then there's more room for us to perceive those things.
Wow. Okay. So I have to ask you this too, because in all of this, another thing I just have to tell people, by the way, we haven't even scratched the surface of what you share in this book. I mean, the, you always blow my mind with the level of detail. And I always think, how much research do you do, Nicholas, to really just like condense and give it to all of us crystal clear? Quite literally, you do that. But I know that there had to be extensive, experimentation, research, even just to have things come back to your mind to put in the book. When I tell you, if you ever are curious about protection, clearing, even, releasing cords, all of these kinds of things, this book is so detailed. It's unbelievable. But there's one part where you also talk about working with crystals and the visualization of them. And while if we have them physically, of course, that can amplify, but sometimes we don't. And some things we can do with just visualizing or connecting, say, like to the consciousness of whatever these different crystals may be. And it just came to mind to ask you, do you ever like visualize that? Like, say, you know, visualize like a double terminated crystal as like down your spine? Or is there ever any visualizations that have come to you with, say, there's crystals at home, but you're at band practice? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, so there are so many weird and wonderful things that we can demonstrate crystals do that seemingly break Newtonian physics. And one of those things is how we can demonstrate quantum entanglement. So I am not a quantum physicist, and I will do a really bad job of explaining this to anyone. But there is a famous study that has been replicated several times where two photons, little packets of light energy, are are entrained to one another. They have to be like harmonized with each other.
Mhm.
And so therefore they have to use the same polarizing medium to get them to be lined up in the same way. And the medium typically used for this is quartz. So if we pass two little particles or packets of light energy through quartz, they synchronize in such a way that when when one of them experiences an event, the other one responds to it immediately. Now, light moves pretty quickly. I don't really know how they can observe all of this because I'm not a physicist and I'm not doing the experimental work myself. But what this tells us is that when this quartz crystal gets involved in the relationship, the packets of light are so aligned that irrespective of how much distance is between them, they behave as if they are both undergoing the same phenomenon. One of these little photons could be on Mars, and the other one could be on Earth. And if one turns right, the other one turns right at more or less the same moment, which means information is being transmitted across distance faster than the speed of light
Right.
because there would be a delay otherwise. So crystals are tied into this concept of non locality. I've often heard there's a phrase, and I can't remember the physicist that coined it, but sometimes quantum entanglement is described as spooky action at a distance.
Mm.
So if we develop a relationship with our stones, we can work with them non-locally. We can become entangled with them on this quantum level, poetically, of course,
Yes.
because I don't understand the physics well enough to convey that. And absolutely, we can connect to crystals that are not physically present. There's a brilliant man in the world of originally computer science, but eventually in the world of crystal healing and psychic exploration by the name of Marcel Vogel. And
Mm.
Vogel was one of these early pioneers uh, doing it before it was cool to do.
Yeah.
Um, when it was downright dangerous for his career to do it, he did it anyway. And uh, a method that he sometimes used to demonstrate how we can become like entangled with a crystal to experience that non-locality is we would hold the crystal in our hand and do the exercise, cleanse and program it and do everything. And then we would set it down on the table and do the same thing without touching it. And then you can accomplish the same goal from the next room over. He did a similar experiment using the same kind of breath techniques that he did with crystals on a plant, kind of replicating the Cleve Baxter experiments, or you hook up the plant to the EKG or whatever it is
Yeah.
and aggress upon it, and it makes the needles go crazy. And he found that if he used the same breath techniques that he taught in these kind of crystal applications, he was visiting what was then the Czech Republic, now Czechia. And his lab in San Jose, California had the plant set up. And, this was pre-internet era. So everyone had to like synchronize watches, really, really secure watches. And to the second, when he released the pulse of air in this breathing technique, the plant registered it from the other side of
Wow.
the room.
Wow.
So when we build a relationship, we can work non-locally, but it's putting in the time and energy first, right? Our accountant is only our accountant until we know them more than that. We don't call our accountant up at 3 a.m. saying, "Oh my gosh, my marriage is falling apart. Can you come help me?" They're going to be like, "Sir, I think you have the wrong number."
Right.
So when we need that kind of support from a stone, we absolutely should put in the legwork to build that reciprocal relationship. It's not just what can a crystal do for us. It's what can we do for our crystals? What can we do for the earth? What can we do for the collective? Because crystals are part of that too.
It's so interesting. I'm sure you know this. I mean, listening to everything you just said, I can't not think about the symbols like in Reiki. And, for me, the more I worked with them in practice, because I didn't understand at first. Like initially, the way I was taught is they're just like used in session. And it took a lot of, personal practice to realize like, oh, the intelligence of these symbols are actually teaching me something. And then it became more of a working with the essence of the symbols in the same way. That's exactly what comes to mind when you're talking about the crystals and how we can work with the essence of them. And I mean, really, with everything we talk about, technically, like we're in relationship to everything anyway. It's just what bonds do we strengthen? What connections do we pour into to allow a different kind of relationship, kind of even how we can feel each other, like just like we do in Kaku. And it's all points to the same thing, Nicholas, even the crystals.
It does. The greatest mystery of the universe is not very mysterious on surface level, and it's we're all one.
Yeah.
It, it's almost anticlimactic that
Yeah.
everything is always pointing us there. And I think this kind of brings up an interesting conundrum with protection. If we're all one, what am I really protecting myself from? And I think it's one of those philosophical quandaries that I don't have a clear and concise answer for.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I think one of the kind of underlying principles that I'm making in the book is that it's not, us versus them, me versus the world, my energy versus your energy, good versus bad.
Yeah.
It's, do I have the bandwidth to be in alignment with my true self, with my
Yeah.
purpose on earth? Um, we can all be one and still throw a wrench in the gears of life. We can all be one and still get on each other's nerves. We
Yeah.
can all be one and still be stuck in these material bodies that no matter how hard we try will always be separate material bodies.
Right.
So we have to kind of reconcile the difference between the absolute truth and our relative experience of it.
Yeah.
And if attempting to perceive the world through the lens of oneness is really good in a metaphorical and philosophical sense, there are absolutely people I do not want in my home.
Right.
There are people that I don't want making decisions about the way I'm going to live my life and
Right.
how my loved ones are going to be treated.
Right.
And that is the challenge here. And so navigating protection work from the framework of compassion. It is compassionate to me to say, actually, you know what? I'm going to remove myself from this conversation. It is
Right.
compassionate for me when I say, I have no energy left to respond to this email. It is compassionate for me when a guest is making a scene in the retail job when I was doing that, 5+ days a week to say, I'm really sorry, my friend. I'm going to have to ask you to leave
Right.
because this is a disruptive situation for everyone here. And there's not an ego in that. There's not a I'm more important, so I'm going to protect my light. I mean, self-care is community care. Like,
Yeah.
if I can't take care of this vessel, I can't show up for my community. If I can't navigate the strains on my own life with enough grace and compassion, I can't replenish my battery enough to make sure that I can carry the torch for others. And sometimes it feels really selfish to say, I just can't do any of that today.
Yeah.
Like, self-care isn't, binge watching your favorite show on Netflix and sipping tea some days. Lots of days it's just trying to figure out how we're going to make it into the next step. So this book was my pandemic baby. I released two other books during the pandemic. Another
Yeah.
reason this is so long. I started it in 2019. I had a book come out in 2022 and another one in 2023.
Mhm.
Um, so just trying to figure out how to hold that space when the world was so uncertain
Yeah.
and more people wanted protection. Like, we went from, it was already the number one question to, I mean, so many things happened in 2020 during the early stages of writing this book.
Yeah.
The tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among so many other bright lights,
Yeah.
um, and global political uncertainty, and you know everything. It doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum. We're all human beings, and we were all experiencing the collective uncertainty. And so I think if I'd finished this book in 27 days, which was never going to happen, but if I had, I would have missed such an important opportunity to examine my own baggage and call myself on my own BS in life, and
Right.
have some other people call me on my own BS, and then to go through personal upheaval. And um, by the time I finished writing the book, it wasn't the same book I intended to write. And the challenging bit is I don't write in linear order, like
Mhm.
rarely ever. It's very rare that happens. So it's not like chapter one is pre-pandemic and the end of the directory is post-pandemic, or whatever you want to call now. It's little bits all over. So having a really good editor who can help me reconcile some challenges in the narrative and tie some loose ends together is really important. But somehow it came together. And it just goes back to this idea of protection is a really universal human desire. Safety. Let's even just
Right.
take the word protection out. Safety is a universal, not just human desire, but human need.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to provide some energetic ways with the help of crystals to cultivate a sense of safety in the world.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is with you again, I mean, you are so detailed and it's amazing how much a person would learn just from reading like 5 pages of any of your books. I remember the very first book I read of yours was the Archetypal Goddess, um, about crystals as well. And it was my introduction to you. And I remember thinking, what? Like in the first few pages, I felt like I had a full blown class. And this is no different. Any of your books that I've read, That's just the way you have this beautiful way of helping to simplify what may be very complicated for a lot of us, but you always hit the work from all different angles. Like you cover the spectrum. And that was one of the things in here too. I wanted to share with everyone because I thought this was like such a very useful thing you added in the section where you talk about psychic attacks, another thing that people are very afraid of. You're not just providing in this book how we can protect ourselves or how to work with these energies. You're explaining, giving us reference of what is a psychic attack and just clarifying that before we move on to the protection. But you provided a list of good questions to even concern before we go spin out on, down some rabbit hole. And I thought, again, there's the brilliance of Nicholas. Like really making sure you create a clear picture before just giving us the tools.
Yeah, I think it is so important that we can approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. I am a lot more skeptical these days than I ever was in my youth. I would also argue that I probably have fewer in number mystical experiences in life, but much greater in quality of the ones that
Mm,
I do have. And part of that is probably familiarity with the territory, right? The first time you go to the big fancy mall the next town over, it's incredible. And like when
mm,
you go once a month, your whole life, it's just the mall in the next town over.
right.
So it's part of it is that, but that kind of skepticism that allows us to question things isn't about trying to prove that everything is fake or wrong or made up. It's about trying to get to the bottom of things. And when we are dealing with psychic harm, whether it is an intentional attack or something kind of accidental or energy vampirism or geopathic stress, ritual curse, which is
Mm,
very rare. But no matter what it is, we have to learn how to ask the right questions. If we don't ask effective questions, we don't get effective answers.
right.
So one of the first things we do, we think we're experiencing psychic attack. There's a list of signs in this chapter in the book. Common ones are like fatigue, bad dreams, a sense of being out of step with time, your bad luck and misfortune, unusual illness or injury. And, one or two of these things, no big deal. But when you start getting a lot of them, then we want to like raise some questions. But before we can even ask the other questions, we have to say to ourselves, what could be the cause of each of these things individually? Oh, well, I'm having bad dreams and poor sleep because I'm staying up super late and eating half a gallon of ice cream every night. That's on me. Like I am the psychic attack. I did that to myself. In very ancient and mystical ways involving my GI tract, right? It's
Yep.
it's it's not something out there trying to get me. So if we go through the list and we rule out the mundane things, also being sensitive to the fact that some of those phenomena overlap with the territory of mental health. I'm not qualified to help someone through that. And if you see those things, seek out someone who is and
Right.
just eliminate it. Peace of mind is a really great thing. Um, so we're like, okay, I can't explain why these things are here or where they're coming from. There's no identifiable cause in the mundane, in the immediate social environment. My next step is to say, okay, if this is some form of psychic attack, I want to corroborate that. And so I teach divination as diagnosis. And this could be your favorite tarot or oracle set. It could be throwing some bones or lithomancy or whatever tool you've got.
Yeah.
Um, for folks who are not, we'll say, really well experienced diviners, two very simple methods give us clear yes or no. They are a pendulum and casting lots or drawing lots. You can just use black and white stone.
Loved that.
Yeah. Um, but even those things, even though they can give us very clear yes or no, it doesn't matter if we don't ask the right question.
Hmm.
If the question is, has so and so been cursed? Well, did so and so cut someone off in traffic and did the other driver lean out of the window and shout some colorful four-letter words? They got cursed. But is that the reason they're having some bad luck? we have to ask a more effective question, like, is so and so currently experiencing a psychic attack?
Right.
Um, are these symptoms indicative of psychic harm? Is the source of this attack known to so and so? And asking those kinds of questions is useful because it helps us determine what the next step is. If the answer confidently across the board is no, well, guess what? Sometimes we just have bad luck. I hate to say it, but a lot of things don't mean anything. A
Right.
lot of times stuff just happens.
Yeah.
Like there's no deeper spiritual reason to use sneezing when the pollen count is high.
Right.
You just have allergies. We when we try to attribute a spiritual reason to otherwise mundane things, we outsource our sovereignty.
Yeah.
This other thing has control over my life and I have no agency here. And if we're constantly doing that, we disempower ourselves so systematically that when we do experience genuine psychic harm, we probably will have no ability to counteract it on our own without doing a lot of legwork first.
So good. This is why, again, the way that you did the book is incredible because you do give a lot of groundwork first of like what the personal clarification and understanding may be prior to even choosing which thing to do that's in the book. And I have to tell you, the casting lots, I had never seen that before, and I was excited. I'm going to create my own little bag. And I know, can you believe the first hour is already over? I want to make sure to tell people how they can learn from you, where we can get the book. But I also have to say, Nicholas, one of the things I hope that people read in the book is about the unintentional projections, even because that was great to read about. I think a lot of people don't realize sometimes when you may feel someone in your space or you feel like, oh, Bob is projecting some bad things on me, it's not intentional. So you do talk about this in the book, but also from this conversation, it points out how, you know, how we always say we fear the unknown, but that could be a beautiful way of leading us into curiosity and study. And if it's just coming to mind that sometimes fear could be like a great catalyst into expanding our awareness and consciousness.
Yeah, it reminds me of like the image of the wrathful deities
Yeah,
in esoteric Buddhism and some related practices, geographically or otherwise.
right.
Um, you know, they're not just mad at stuff. That's
Right.
that's not a great look. We've met deities like that. We've met people like that, but the wrathful deity channels that wrath into productive, compassionate action.
Mhm.
When we start to fear, when we start to get that tinge of worry, better if we can get it when the first butterfly is felt in our stomach rather than when they turn into like ravenous, bloodthirsty moths and
Right.
devour us from the inside out. But when we first start to feel that, go, I wonder what could be causing this.
Mhm.
I wonder why I feel this way. I wonder what this mystical experience is connected to. Um, and and you'll be surprised at what you end up with. Being curious is, I think, one of my superpowers. I want to know stuff. And if I can learn it and share it with others, I will. That's why I started teaching in the first place, because I liked learning stuff. I started writing as an extension of my teaching because more people can go find a book on a bookshelf than they can like track me down in person.
Right. Well, that's the challenge I found for myself. So this last year, when I did a Reiki retreat after a very long time, I decided to write a book to go. I have such a hard time of knowing when to stop because then I get excited and I'm down rabbit holes and I'm like, oh, I should talk about this too. Oh, I should talk about this too. Like I need some way of reeling it back in. But anyway, I want to make sure that people know what you have upcoming because on March 1st, you have a crystal healing workshop that is online that people can attend. So, in this particular workshop, will people learn some of what is in the book, or is it a different topic around crystals?
Yeah, thank you. So this is absolutely related to the book. The book was the inspiration for the class. So I'm in that like brand new phase, when your new baby is born, you want to show everyone
Yes.
pictures and share pictures on Facebook every day. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Every class seems to be inspired by the book itself, and I'm trying to make sure everyone is its own thing.
Mhm.
So on March 1st, I've got a crystal healing class. It's all about cleansing, aligning, and protecting with Earth's energy. So we're gonna learn some common tools for protection. We're actually gonna like none of the nitty gritty stuff we got a chance to cover in this hour. We're gonna
I
cover
know.
that. And there'll be hands-on practices, as hands-on as we can make it in the
Right.
virtual space. And I'm excited for it. My hosts are the Theosophical Society in America, and I've done a couple events, free and paid, with them in the past. So it's always a really good time. And going forward through the remainder of the year, I will have some in-person and some virtual classes related to this book and to other stuff. So if anyone wants to like find those things, the easiest place to see everything I'm doing is at my website, and that's theluminouspearl.com, or just find me on social media. It's probably at the Luminous Pearl. Um, and 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 there you are.
Oh, I'm going to put the links for both down in the show description. So the website, theluminouspearl.com, and I know your Instagram is also the Luminous Pearl. I'll put the links for both below. The workshop again is on March 1st, but he has a ton of things, and we're going to talk about more in hour two. But this book, really truly crystals for psychic self-defense, 145 gemstones for banishing, binding, and magical protection. You're right. There's so much. If you could see the notes I had to ask you about this, but get the book. I mean, you'll never be sorry if you buy a Nicholas Pearson book. And I'm saying that from really reading all the books I could get my hands on. So thank you for doing it again, for giving us a way of learning in a very easy way, Nicholas. But it's not over because, as I mentioned, Nicholas is also provides so much for the Reiki community. And we're going to get into that in hour two. And who knows, crystals may still come up. So join us on Wednesday for our second conversation, and we'll see you over there.
Thank you so much.